The designers of the VBA programming language understood that many of the users who create their own code will not be professional programmers. Rather than enforcing some of the best practices, such as naming all of your variables before you use them in your code, the VBA language lets you create variables in the middle of a subroutine or function without declaring them earlier. It's tempting to use that flexibility to avoid declaring your variables, but it can lead to problems. So I'll just show you the code that I'm using for this example. And what this code does is calculate a commission at a rate of 5% based on a sale, whatever value is in the active cell on the active sheet in the workbook, and then it rounds that value to 2 decimal places so it looks like a dollar value. If you want to declare a variable at the top of your code, then you can type the dim keyword. Dim stands for dimension, or to give something dimension, and then you type the name of the variable. In this case, we'll have CUR value, and then you need to give it its type. In this case, it's a currency, so we'll call it currency. The next variable is the rate, so we'll type that there. It can be kind of a pain to type every variable on its own line, so you can double up if you want to, but you need to do it in a specific way. For example, let me show you what happens if I were to type a variable dimension statement this way. The last variable that I need to define is the commission in the bottom, so that's CUR, COMMISSION, as currency. When I move off of that line, as currency changes to blue, which means that it's a keyword and it's being implemented. And it looks like both the value and the commission variables are defined as currency, but in fact, that is not the case. Only the commission variable is defined as a currency. The value is defined as a variant. Now, most of the time that won't lead to an error, but you might run into a situation, especially in another programming language, which is what they say more strongly typed, then you might have a bad interaction there. So again, in Excel VBA, it probably won't be deadly, but in other programming languages that you learn, it might be. So you might ask, what's the proper way to declare that variable? Well, you need to have the value also assigned the currency type. Once you do that, all of the variables in your procedure are now defined as currency. If you want to run the subroutine, just press F5, and you see that the commission has been calculated. Now let's see what happens if you don't declare your variables properly. Let's say, for example, that instead of typing CUR rate, I make what for me is a very common typo, and I type my first name, Kurt, as opposed to CUR. Now that variable has no value assigned because it's different from this variable. It has a different name. Now if I press F5, the commission is 0. That's because it was multiplied by a blank value or a null value, and therefore it results in 0. So how can you avoid that problem? You can avoid it by using the option explicit declaration. Option explicit requires you to declare all of your variables before you use them in the body of your program. You do that by typing option explicit up in what's called the declarations section. The declarations section is at the very top of a code module, and you'll see when the cursor is here, it's part of the calculate commission subroutine. When it's above that, it's in the declaration section. So you can type in declarations such as option explicit and others that I'll get to later in the course. So if I were to type option explicit and press return, the declaration section is set apart from the rest of the subroutines. And now if I press F5, I get a compile error saying that a variable is not defined, and very helpfully, the Visual Basic Editor highlights it. So I'll click OK. And now I see that I have a typo. This variable isn't defined here. So if I delete the stray letter and then click the reset button on top to reset the subroutine, I can now press F5 and get the result that I need. Declaring your variables before you use them in a code module helps you remember which variables exist and prevents mistyped variable names from making your programs fail in mysterious ways. There's very little more frustrating than discovering that transposing 2 letters cost you 4 hours of detective work to find the problem.